All right, so we're beginning Unit 2, and our first lecture here has to do with microbial nutrition. So what we're trying to understand here is what does a cell look like from a component level, looking at things like the building blocks of carbon and nitrogen and things of that nature, and then how do we connect those to the nutritional or physiological needs of a cell. So starting off with a broad look, most of a cell is water. About 70% on average. Is going to depend on what cell and what condition. The next most prevalent thing are proteins. So proteins are going to make up a large chunk of what's left over after the water. The remainder of that is going to be much more spread out. So we're going to kind of keep those two things being the broad components. But when you look at the next part, the building blocks of the cell largely come from 4 elements. So these include things like carbon, one of the main building blocks of all life forms, hydrogen, one of the next most common building blocks, then oxygen, and nitrogen. So overall, roughly 95, 96%, depending on who exactly you ask, of all life is primarily constructed with just those 4 elements. So these are going to make up your proteins, a lot of the water, lipids, carbohydrates, etc. So there are a handful of other what we often call trace or mineral elements that make up the roughly 4 to 5% of what's left over, but most of your building blocks come from just those 4 elements alone. So we're talking about microbial nutrition. So the question here is, what is nutrition? Ultimately, a process where chemical substances are acquired and used in cellular activities. And these would include things like metabolism and growth. Now, as far as nutrients are concerned, you're going to have a couple different terms here. Essential nutrient is one that's required. Macronutrients are those that are required in large quantities. It doesn't have to do with the size of the nutrient, but the amount of required abundance of it. So you'll need lots of micronutrients. Micronutrients are still necessary, but usually in much smaller amounts. So these tend to play important, but more roles that are more specific to a microenvironment. So you don't need as much of them, and that's what those 2 terms indicate. Now, when we get into the types of organisms, this has a determination on how they acquire their sources of energy. So, for example, a heterotroph is one that gets its energy from an organic source. So a heterotroph is basically an organism that means you have to go eat something or digest something that is already either a living thing or a byproduct of a living thing. In other words, they're dependent on other organisms for nutrients. So you and I, as human beings, we're a heterotroph, and all animals are heterotrophs. There can be different categories of heterotrophs, but broadly speaking, we have to go get our food and energy from another organism. Okay, so ultimately we can get it either from other heterotrophs. For example, if a human eats meat, we're getting our energy from another heterotroph. You could also get it from an autotroph, and the autotroph is the second category that's distinct from a heterotroph. Okay, so this says heterotrophs versus autotrophs. So as an animal heterotroph, you could get it from another heterotroph or an autotroph. And autotrophs are essentially organisms that can get their energy from an inorganic source, which is largely predicated around things like carbon dioxide, but also water. So these are very commonly things like plants. Plants can simply suck CO2 and water out of the air and build their energy sources just using the inorganic molecules in the air. You and I as animals can't do that, so we're a heterotroph. Plants and things like algae are a distinct group that are referred to as autotrophs. Now this table from your textbook goes into a little bit more detail about those, so you want to reference this table here in your book. So it goes into a little more detail, for example, photoautotrophs. That's actually the more specific category of things like plants. So over here it gives some examples. Algae, plants, and then cyanobacteria are a specific kind of photosynthetic bacteria. And then it mentions things like autotrophs. You won't need to know that for this class, but that goes into some sub-detail of different types of autotrophs. And then heterotrophs, more technically, are called heterotrophs. And so, as I mentioned, animals, but other things like fungi and protozoa. And then it kind of goes into the difference between saprobe and parasite, breaking down kind of the nature of where that organic material comes from. So you don't have to memorize everything on this table, but it does add some more context to the discussion here. Okay, moving on into some of the main elements. I mentioned carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. So when we look at carbon, this really is the main building block for life. It's the kind of the foundational building block that everything else is centered around. So where you get your carbon is part of the determination of whether you're a heterotroph or an autotroph, like we just discussed. So heterotrophs basically have to get their carbon from some other organism, as we just described. So this just kind of adds to that, meaning that not only do you get the energy, but also the building blocks like carbon. Autotrophs, as I mentioned, they can suck carbon dioxide directly out of the air, which is technically inorganic, and they can literally build their cellular material largely from the air as they're absorbing it. And so that's one of the things that makes them auto. Auto means self, and troph kind of refers to a feeder. So this kind of means self-feeder, autotroph. And hetero means other feeder is what that kind of means. So you're feeding off of others or you're feeding from yourself is what those two terms mean. So that kind of relates to the carbon itself. And then carbon, if you want to make a quick side note, carbon is one of the main building blocks for all organic molecules in life. Now, nitrogen is one that as a heterotroph, you're ultimately going to get that as you're eating sources of organic nutrients like heterotrophs or other autotrophs. They're going to ultimately have their own proteins and nucleic acids which contain the nitrogen, and so as you absorb this other organism, you're absorbing their nitrogen from their base level of protein and nucleic acid. And so then ultimately, as we'll show later, these are used to build new proteins and nucleic acids. So nitrogen is ultimately broken down and recycled over and over and over again, used to build protein and nucleic acid, and then broken down from protein and nucleic acid to build new ones. So there's a lot of recycling that goes on there. Now, generally speaking, nitrogen comes in a lot of different forms. There's actually the majority of the air in the atmosphere is largely nitrogen, but most of that nitrogen is not usable. So there are actually fairly complex biochemical pathways in nature that take nitrogen and ultimately convert it into a form called ammonia, NH3. And that's really the form that our cells absorb, especially as animals, to make that usable for us. So nitrogen typically has to be made available in that form. Now, hydrogen, another key building block in life, the second most common after carbon, is one that is largely used to make up a lot of the periphery around the carbon. So carbon is kind of the main building block, and then hydrogen kind of fills in a lot of the elemental space around carbon. And ultimately, it is a major part of both organic and inorganic sources. So sugars, for example, contain lots of hydrogen, but also things like water. And water is going to be one of the main places where you find hydrogen in an inorganic source. But when we look at the function in cells, hydrogen is really important for pH, so acid-base balances. Hydrogen is actually one of the primary things that you're measuring in reference to something that's acidic. Hydrogen is also really important for forming bonds between molecules. These are called hydrogen bonds. In a more complex way, it also serves as a key part of oxidation reduction reactions, which we will talk about that a little bit in the next chapter on metabolism. But oxidation reduction reactions, this largely refers to photosynthesis, what we see in plants, and cellular respiration, which we see in both plants and animals. And so cellular respiration is the way that your mitochondria break down energy to make ATP. And so hydrogen is a key part of the energy transfer process, which is what we call oxidation reduction. Oxygen is another one. We all know that we need to breathe oxygen, but as far as a building block, it plays a key role in the structure of things like lipids and carbohydrates, enzymatic reactions and things of that nature. But really, besides being a building block, the main reason that we actually breathe oxygen in is that during the process where our mitochondria are making ATP, we need oxygen in that process. And what it does is it serves as a dumping site for electrons. And so here it's referred to as a terminal electron acceptor. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the next chapter as well. But the main reason that you need to breathe oxygen ultimately is to act as an electron acceptor during cellular respiration, the process by which your body is making energy in the form of ATP. So that's actually why you end up breathing oxygen. So mitochondria, ATP, oxygen is required. And what happens when you stop breathing is your body loses the ability to make energy, and cells start to immediately cease to function because that energy is necessary at all points throughout your life. Oxygen is also involved in various enzymatic reactions. So, for example, in our liver cells and really all of our cells in the body, we have various detoxification processes that use oxygen and enzyme catalysts to kind of remove waste and clear up harmful products that build up due to natural processes in the cell. So moving on to some of the more smaller needed quantities of still important elements, phosphorus is one of these. So phosphorus can come from both inorganic and organic sources. Inorganic meaning kind of non-living. Interestingly, one of the main areas that phosphorus comes from is from things like rocks, and it leaches out of the rocks very slowly over time, and then starts to build up in the environment. Another source are oceanic mineral deposits, and so ultimately, most of the phosphorus on Earth has come from these inorganic sources over time, and then eventually builds up into organic sources, which can then be recycled from one living organism to the next. Organic sources would be things like cell membranes. If you remember, the phospholipids are the key building block of cellular membranes. So phosphate, phosphorus is a key part of that specific aspect of that lipid. And then also nucleic acids, so DNA and RNA in particular have lots of phosphorus that help build the DNA and RNA molecules. And so we'll talk about that a little bit in the chapter on genetics, but that's another area where they're used. Now, another interesting thing about phosphorus is that this tends to be one of the rate-limiting steps of metabolic activities, growth, metabolism. You're only as strong as your weakest link in the chain, or you're only as fast as the slowest runner in a relay race. So that's kind of like phosphorus. You tend to see that you can only grow with the extent that phosphorus is available. So one of the things that you do in farming and agriculture is you pump lots of extra nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil or wherever it's at, and that tends to really boost growth. So normally it tends to be fairly limited, and it tends to limit the rate of growth for most organisms. Next one here, last one on the list is sulfur. Sulfur is one that's super important, but also not needed in large abundance, but it's a key building block for essential vitamins, like vitamin B1 is an example. Also another key building block for some of the amino acids, like cysteine and methionine. These are 2 of your 20 amino acids. So these 2 in particular require sulfur, and because these amino acids are heavily used in building protein, you end up needing a decent, not a lot of sulfur rather, but you need a consistent supply of sulfur in order to have proper amino acid abundance and then protein production and protein synthesis. So this is another one that is required, but not in large doses. So as long as you have a small amount of sulfur, you usually are sufficient, but it is necessary for those key things. Now, next on the list, we're going to look at a sort of a broader perspective. All life is made up from 4 families of biological molecules. So, for example, you have carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are largely in animals used for energy. In plants, they're used for both energy and building blocks like the plant cell wall, which makes up cellulose. But carbohydrates are one of these 4 big families of molecules that life is derived from. The next one is lipids or fats. as we talked about before, these are used in things like cell membranes. But as you're probably already aware, fats are also used for things like energy storage. Fats can also be used for things like hormone production and creating wax, which is a protective layer for many different organisms. Next one are the nucleic acids. These would be your DNA and RNA. Nucleic acids are a key part of information storage in a cell. DNA, a form of information, is one of the big areas nucleic acids play a role. And then proteins. And we've talked about proteins a little bit in the past, but proteins serve a wide variety of functions. But that's your main, that's the fourth main class of biological molecules. Now, each one of these are derived from a monomer unit. These are essentially individual units that link together to make up the family. So, for example, monosaccharides are the building blocks of carbohydrates. Fatty acids are one of the main building blocks of lipids. Nucleotides are the main building blocks of nucleic acids, and amino acids are the main building blocks of proteins. Okay, so just real quick to illustrate this, the way it works is that your monomers, are going to start off as little base units representing by this circle here. This largely applies for all these different monomers, monosaccharides, fatty acids, nucleotides, and amino acids. So those can all be represented by a circle here. So in the body, you'll have kind of a storage of monomer units. And ultimately then these monomer units are going to be linked together by various types of chemical bonds represented right here by that line. And they'll be linked together, and the linkage creates this larger structure, which is what we would start to refer to as that family. Another way to describe this here is as a polymer. So mono, one, poly means many. So polymer or macromolecule, large molecule, is how these start to come together. So individual units linked into big groups, and then through digestion, the polymers can be converted back into monomers. So as we chew up our food and we digest it in our gut, what we're actually doing there is taking these chains of monomers and breaking them back down into the individual monomers themselves. And then later, the monomers get pulled into the cell, represented here, and once inside the cell, then they can go through metabolism, which is where we actually extract the energy from them. So technically, digestion and metabolism are two different things. We often think of them as together. But digestion is the process by taking polymers and converting them into monomers. Monomers are then small enough to be absorbed into the cell, in which case the metabolism, which takes place inside the cell, breaks down the monomers further and ultimately is what makes our energy in the form of ATP by taking those monomers and stripping the energy out of them. So that's kind of how those families work in relation to the metabolic and digestive processes in the cell. Okay, so next we're going to take and make a few diagrams here connecting the elements that we've discussed to some key structures in the cell, such as the DNA and RNA made up of nucleotides, and then proteins made up of amino acids. So here we've got a figure of a nucleic acid, a nucleotide. And what we want to show here is that our nucleotides, depending on where you want to start exactly, we can start with the carbohydrate. So this would be like, for example, DNA. And this represents a nucleotide. So this would be an individual monomer of DNA, or a nucleic acid. That's supposed to be an L right there. So what we have, I mentioned earlier, they look like circles, and we link these together. But more specifically, rather than a circle, we're actually going to have a unit here. Looks like a pentamer, and or a pentagon, excuse me. And this is actually going to be a carbohydrate, carb, or you might also think of it as a sugar. So this is actually one of the key parts of a DNA molecule, and the name itself, DNA, stands for deoxyribose nucleic acid. And this carbohydrate here is called a deoxyribose sugar, is what that actually is called. So it's a very specific kind of sugar. But here we're going to find our carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, all part of a typical carbohydrate. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So all sugars are made up of those three elements in many different forms. Now, what we're going to end up using to link these together are largely going to be based around phosphorus. So this is one of the key areas where phosphorus is used, but as you can see in my example figure, there's also things like oxygen and a little bit of hydrogen. But phosphorus is kind of one of the big ones here, so I'm just going to make that the main point here, P for phosphorus. And then sticking off on the other side of our carbohydrate sugar, we're going to have different variations of this structure here, but kind of making it similar to my example. This is where we're going to find lots of nitrogen. And so nitrogen is a key part of your DNA nucleotide. And in fact, this component here is often referred to as a nitrogen base because it's heavily constructed from nitrogen. So we have actually a nitrogen base. So we have a sugar here, we have a nitrogen base over here, and this over here, I forgot to label that, that's actually referred to as a phosphate group. So you can start to see kind of where these elements fill in on some of these key building blocks of life, one of the big ones being DNA. Sugar, nitrogen, phosphate. Okay, next one is going to be to diagram the amino acid and to connect some of these elements to its structure. So I'm using this as my example here. So when it comes to amino acids, all amino acids are based around carbon. So we're going to have a carbon element right in the middle, and that's going to be connected to a hydrogen above it. Now, branching off on one side, we're going to have another carbon connected to oxygen in a couple different types of bonds there, double versus a single. And this part of it over here makes up what's referred to as a functional group. So this, what's in the circle here, is a functional group. And this is referred to as a carboxyl. A carboxyl group. Now this is sometimes called a carboxylic, quote unquote, acid. And I'll mention why I'm just describing it that way here in a second. So it's technically acidic by itself. So that's all sort of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen right there so far. Now where nitrogen comes in is on the other side. We'll have a nitrogen base bonded to either 2 or 3 different hydrogens. Okay, this one shows 3 here. So we have nitrogen and hydrogen making up the other side of the amino acid. So this here then becomes another functional group, sometimes called an amine or an amino functional group. So where they got the name amino acid is by naming it after these 2 functional groups. So we have an amino group, and as I mentioned, a carboxylic acid group. And so that is ultimately where the name amino acid is derived from there. Now, clear some space here. The last part of an amino acid is arguably the most important. So if we look down here, this is showing what's called an R group. R ultimately is better understood as a variable group. Variable means that it is different. And what we find is that we have ultimately 20 different amino acids, and it is this position sticking down from that carbon in the R position, it is that exact position that makes all 20 amino acids unique. Otherwise, they're actually all the same in these first two aspects here. In fact, the hydrogen is always there, the carbon is always there, you always have a carboxylic acid or a carboxyl group, and you always have an amino group. So those three aspects there are always the same. Let me just highlight those here in a different color here. So if we just kind of highlight everything in red here, everything within this position is 100% the same for all 20 of your amino acids. But where they each become distinctly different is in this R group. That's what makes all 20 of them variable. And so I'm going to show that next here, how they all look different. So 20 different amino acids, each with a different R group, variable group, also referred to as a side chain. So there's really three different ways you can describe that: R group, variable group, or side chain. You'll see different sources use different examples there. Now they've illustrated this a little bit differently, but what you're seeing up here, this would be the spot where the carbon is bound. This over here is the carboxylic acid or carboxyl group, and this over here is the amino group right here. This sticking down here is that linkage to the R group, and then everything down here below represents that variable group. Okay, so we have 20 different amino acids, and they're all listed on this page. Everything from arginine, histidine, lysine, cysteine. We talked about cysteine earlier. Methionine is another one. By the way, you can see the sulfur here and here, as I mentioned earlier. So all of these have different chemistry in that R group. And so all of these parts that stick down are what those represent. And so ultimately, what's going to happen with proteins is all of these different side chains are what are going to lead to the different shapes that proteins form. If you remember earlier, we talked about how proteins form different shapes and ultimately different functions. And although it's complex, it is actually these side groups that are ultimately responsible for the protein folding and forming those different shapes. And we're going to talk about that more next week in our first lesson when we talk about protein structure and function. So we'll actually go into more of that later. But for now, we're just kind of connecting this to the elements and the building blocks here. Okay, so you can see that these are all different. They all have different arrangements, and that is ultimately going to lead to the variation in proteins that we see. Last thing I want to do is connect back to another concept I've mentioned as well, which would be the central dogma of biology. So we want to diagram the central dogma, which I've discussed that before, but as a reminder, the central dogma can be described as DNA being converted arrow to RNA, RNA being converted to protein. So DNA, arrow, RNA, arrow, protein. That's the central dogma, okay? So where we want to make some connections here, nucleotides, which we just diagrammed a minute ago, ultimately carry the quote-unquote blueprints for how to build proteins. So the information that we assemble from nucleotides ultimately spells out how to make protein. These blueprints more specifically tell us how to build the protein sequence, that polymer chain of amino acids. And then ultimately, the protein sequence will be based upon the type, order, and number of amino acids. And so ultimately, all these elements kind of come together, starting one base at a time and forming larger and larger complexes that, in a very mysterious way, give us information in the form of a blueprint that executes function in the aspects of protein shape. And that's ultimately how we get life working the way it works, each element forming building blocks to form larger structures. Okay, so we'll go into more on this in our next lecture with environmental adaptations, taking a more sort of practical look at how microorganisms adapt to their environment. And then the following week, we'll take a closer look at protein structure and function, and then we'll take a look at cellular respiration and metabolism, how life forms actually create energy. So that'll do it for this lesson.